June 1942 would later be remembered as the moment the illusion cracked. But just months earlier, the Axis powers stood at what seemed like the height of unstoppable momentum. In early 1942, the map of the world appeared to be tilting decisively in their favor. Germany dominated continental Europe from the Atlantic coast of France to the outskirts of Moscow. In North Africa, Erwin Rommel's Africa Corps was pushing British forces back toward Egypt. And in the Pacific, Japan was advancing with a speed and coordination that stunned even seasoned military observers. The shock of Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, had not only crippled much of the United States Pacific Fleet, it had transformed global perception overnight. Battleships lay burning in Hawaii. American airfields were devastated, and over 2,400 Americans were dead. To many in Berlin and Tokyo, it appeared that the United States had been strategically paralyzed at the very opening of the war. The Imperial Japanese Navy had executed one of the most complex carrier-based strikes in history, with precision, secrecy, and devastating effect. But Pearl Harbor was only the beginning. Within weeks, Japanese forces swept through Southeast Asia with relentless efficiency. The Philippines fell after months of resistance. General Douglas MacArthur was forced to withdraw to Australia. In Malaya, British defenses collapsed far more quickly than London had expected. The supposedly impregnable fortress of Singapore surrendered in February 1942, over 80,000 British and Commonwealth troops taken prisoner in what Winston Churchill later called the worst disaster in British military history. In the Dutch East Indies, Japan seized vital oil fields, securing the resources necessary to fuel its expanding war machine. At sea, Japanese carrier groups roamed the Pacific with confidence. Their coordinated air power had sunk or damaged Allied ships from the Indian Ocean to the Coral Sea. The attack on the British naval base at Ceylon in April 1942 further reinforced the impression that no Allied fleet could challenge Japan's dominance. The Imperial Japanese Navy had perfected the art of carrier warfare. Massed airstrikes launched from fast-moving task forces, supported by experienced pilots who had trained for years before the war began. Unlike many of their adversaries, Japanese naval aviators entered the conflict battle-hardened from years of operations in China. To outside observers, including German intelligence analysts, Japan's carrier fleet appeared nearly invincible. Aircraft carriers, not battleships, had become the decisive instruments of naval warfare. The age of massive gun duels between armored giants was fading. Control of the sea now depended on control of the air above it. A single carrier group could project power hundreds of miles beyond the horizon. It could strike first, strike hard, and disappear before the enemy even knew where it had been. In Berlin, this transformation was studied carefully. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder and the German Naval Command understood that Germany itself lacked a comparable carrier force. The Kriegsmarine was built around submarines and surface raiders, not large-scale naval aviation. But Japan's success offered something else: strategic balance. As long as Japan tied down American forces in the Pacific, the United States would be forced to divide its industrial and military strength between two oceans. Adolf Hitler had declared war on the United States in December 1941, just days after Pearl Harbor. Many historians have debated that decision, but at the time, Hitler believed the move aligned with long-term reality. He was convinced that conflict with America was inevitable. By striking first in Europe's interest through alliance solidarity with Japan, he calculated that the Axis could stretch American resources thin. The United States would have to fight in the Atlantic against German U-boats while simultaneously defending vast Pacific territories against Japan's expanding perimeter. In early 1942, this calculation did not seem irrational. American mobilization was still in its early stages. Shipyards were accelerating production, but new carriers and warships would take time to complete. Training pilots, organizing fleets, and coordinating joint operations required months, even years. Meanwhile, Japan held the initiative. Its defensive perimeter now stretched thousands of miles, from the Aleutian Islands in the north to the Solomon Islands in the south, and westward deep into Southeast Asia. For German planners, this meant opportunity. If Japan maintained pressure in the Pacific, the United States might prioritize revenge against Tokyo over immediate large-scale intervention in Europe. Every American carrier deployed westward was one less escorting convoys across the Atlantic. Every division sent to defend Australia was a division not landing in France. Axis strategy relied on not perfect coordination, but on simultaneous crises overwhelming Allied capacity. And there was another assumption, one that would later prove dangerously flawed. Both Berlin and Tokyo underestimated the scale of American industrial power. Pre-war isolationism had masked the reality of what the United States could produce once fully mobilized. In 1942, however, that production surge was still gathering momentum. On the surface, Japan's early victories reinforced the belief that speed and boldness could overcome material disadvantages. Inside the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's heavily fortified headquarters in East Prussia, reports from the Pacific were read with interest and at times admiration. Japan's navy had achieved in months what Germany's surface fleet had failed to accomplish in years: decisive, large-scale disruption of enemy naval power. The destruction of Allied prestige in Asia validated the Axis worldview, that liberal democracies were slow, divided, and strategically timid. The aircraft carrier became a symbol of this new era. Floating airfields capable of launching coordinated strikes across immense distances, carriers reshaped global strategy. The Imperial Japanese Navy possessed some of the most advanced carriers in the world, including Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, vessels that had spearheaded the attack on Pearl Harbor. Together, they formed the core of a striking force unmatched in experience and cohesion. By the spring of 1942, few could imagine that this same force would soon face catastrophic destruction. Confidence within Axis leadership was not merely propaganda, it was rooted in tangible victories and dramatic territorial expansion. The perception of inevitability had begun to take hold. The Allies appeared reactive, scrambling to respond to blows delivered with precision and speed. But beneath the surface, the balance of power was already shifting. American shipyards were working round the clock. Intelligence units were analyzing intercepted communications. Strategic patience was beginning to replace shock. But in early 1942, none of this was fully visible from Berlin. At that moment, the Axis believed time was on its side. Japan's carriers ruled the Pacific. Germany's armies pressed deep into Soviet territory. The United States seemed wounded and unprepared for a prolonged global conflict. The illusion of naval supremacy was complete. And it was precisely this confidence, this belief in unstoppable momentum, that made what happened next so profoundly shocking.
By the spring of 1942, the Japanese Empire stood at what appeared to be the absolute peak of its expansion. Its defensive perimeter stretched across thousands of miles of ocean, fortified by newly captured bases and protected by the most experienced carrier force in the world. Yet behind the confident public statements and ambitious operational maps, a dangerous gamble was taking shape, one that would hinge not just on ships and aircraft, but on information. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Combined Fleet, understood something many others in Tokyo did not. He had lived in the United States, studied at Harvard, and served as a naval attaché in Washington. He knew America's industrial depth. He reportedly warned that Japan could run wild for 6 months to a year, but after that, he had no confidence in ultimate victory. Midway would become his attempt to deliver a decisive blow within that shrinking window of opportunity. The plan was bold, complex, and risky. Yamamoto aimed to lure the remaining U.S. carriers into a trap near Midway Atoll, a small but strategically vital outpost northwest of Hawaii. By capturing Midway, Japan would extend its defensive perimeter eastward and threaten Pearl Harbor itself. More importantly, Yamamoto believed the Americans would be compelled to commit their carriers to defend it. Once drawn out, they would be destroyed in a massive, coordinated ambush. But complexity can be the enemy of clarity. The Japanese plan divided forces across vast distances. Separate groups were assigned to attack the Aleutian Islands as a diversion, while the main carrier strike force, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, would launch air assaults on Midway before preparing to engage American naval units. Timing, surprise, and coordination were essential. If any element failed, the entire operation could unravel. Unbeknownst to Yamamoto, the foundation of surprise was already compromised. Deep inside a basement at Pearl Harbor, a small group of U.S. Navy cryptanalysts worked around the clock at Station Hypo. Led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, they were attempting to decipher Japanese naval communications encrypted in a code system known as JN-25. It was an immense challenge. The code changed periodically, and messages were fragmented and incomplete. But patterns began to emerge. By May 1942, Rochefort and his team believed they had identified AF as the code designation for Midway. To confirm their theory, they devised a simple but brilliant deception. Midway was instructed to send an unencrypted radio message stating that its freshwater distillation system had broken down. Shortly afterward, Japanese communications intercepted by American intelligence reported that AF was experiencing a water shortage. The trap was confirmed. The target was Midway. This breakthrough changed everything. For the first time in the Pacific War, the United States would enter a major naval battle with foreknowledge of enemy intentions. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, now faced a decision. His carrier strength was limited. The USS Enterprise and USS Hornet were available, along with the hastily repaired USS Yorktown, damaged just weeks earlier at the Battle of the Coral Sea. Against them stood 4 veteran Japanese fleet carriers with highly trained air crews. On paper, the balance still favored Japan. But knowledge is a weapon. Nimitz positioned his carriers northeast of Midway, outside Japanese reconnaissance range. He reinforced the island with additional aircraft, Marines, Navy torpedo squadrons, Army bombers, anything that could fly. The plan was simple in concept, but dangerous in execution. Absorb the initial Japanese strike on Midway, then ambush the carriers while their aircraft were rearming and refueling. On June 4, 1942, the battle began before dawn. Japanese aircraft launched from their carriers and struck Midway's defenses, inflicting damage but failing to neutralize the island's airfields. American planes rose to meet them in desperate waves, torpedo bombers flying low and slow, often without fighter escort. Many were shot down. Entire squadrons were devastated. The sacrifice seemed futile. Yet those attacks achieved something unintended but crucial. They forced Japanese combat air patrols down to sea level and disrupted the carriers' defensive posture. Meanwhile, aboard the Japanese carriers, confusion grew. Initial reports suggested Midway was not fully disabled. A second strike might be necessary. Aircraft that had been armed with anti-ship torpedoes were ordered to switch to land attack bombs. Then new intelligence indicated American ships might be nearby. The order was reversed. Bombs were removed. Torpedoes were reloaded. Fuel lines lay exposed across hangar decks crowded with armed aircraft. In war, minutes matter. Shortly after 10:20 a.m., American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown arrived over the Japanese fleet almost simultaneously. By extraordinary coincidence and timing, 3 squadrons converged at once.
With Japanese combat air patrols pulled low by earlier torpedo attacks, the skies above the carriers were momentarily vulnerable. In a matter of minutes, the course of the Pacific War changed. Bombs struck Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu in rapid succession. Hangar decks erupted in flame balls as fuel and munitions ignited. Flames spread uncontrollably. Damage control efforts proved futile. Within hours, 3 of Japan's premier carriers were mortally wounded. Later that afternoon, Hiryu launched a counterstrike that crippled Yorktown, but American dive bombers located Hiryu and set it ablaze as well. 4 fleet carriers, veterans of Pearl Harbor, were lost in a single day. The scale of destruction was staggering. Japan not only lost ships, but irreplaceable pilots and maintenance crews, the core of its naval aviation elite. Years of training vanished in hours. Unlike the United States, Japan lacked the industrial base and pilot training infrastructure to rapidly replace such losses. For American forces, victory had come at a cost, but it was decisive. The strategic initiative in the Pacific shifted. The aura of Japanese invincibility evaporated. Yet beyond the Pacific battlefield, another drama was unfolding. Intelligence reports began traveling across oceans and continents. In Berlin, German naval analysts studied the outcome with growing concern. The assumption that Japan could indefinitely pin down American naval power had just suffered a catastrophic blow. The battle had been decided not only by courage and firepower, but code breakers, deception, and timing. It was proof that modern warfare was no longer determined solely by fleets and formations. Information, hidden, intercepted, and exploited, could alter the fate of empires. Midway was not merely a tactical defeat for Japan, it was the collapse of a carefully constructed illusion. And as the smoke cleared over the Pacific, the consequences were already beginning to ripple outward, towards Tokyo, towards Washington, and towards Berlin, where the shock would soon be deeply felt.
The news did not arrive in Berlin with explosions or flames. It arrived in fragments, naval attaché reports, intercepted communications, diplomatic summaries from Tokyo. At first, it seemed exaggerated. 4 fleet carriers destroyed? That was impossible. Those ships had led the strike on Pearl Harbor. They had roamed the Indian Ocean unchallenged. They were the core of Japan's naval striking power. But as confirmations accumulated in late June 1942, disbelief gave way to silence. Inside the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, Adolf Hitler's heavily fortified military headquarters, the atmosphere was already tense. Operation Barbarossa had stalled before Moscow the previous winter. The Wehrmacht was preparing for a renewed summer offensive toward the Caucasus and Stalingrad. Resources were stretched. The war had expanded far beyond the quick, decisive campaigns Germany had once envisioned. Now came the report from the Pacific. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, gone. For Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, Commander-in-Chief of the Kriegsmarine, the implications were immediate and alarming. Germany's naval strategy depended heavily on Japan's ability to tie down American naval forces in the Pacific. The longer the United States focused westward, the more freedom German U-boats would have in the Atlantic. Every American carrier hunting Japanese fleets was one less escorting convoys to Britain. Midway shattered that assumption. German naval intelligence had long admired the operational sophistication of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Its carrier doctrine, coordination, and pilot training were seen as proof that maritime air power had surpassed the old battleship model. Germany itself had never fully committed to aircraft carrier development. The unfinished Graf Zeppelin saw it as a symbol of that strategic hesitation. Japan, by contrast, had mastered the new form of naval warfare. If even Japan's elite carrier force could be destroyed in a single engagement, what did that say about the balance of power at sea?
Rader reportedly concluded that the battle marked a decisive shift in the naval war, not because Japan had lost territory immediately, it had not, but because it had lost experienced air crews it could not easily replace. Germany understood attrition. On the Eastern Front, losses were measured in divisions, but industrial capacity determined whether those losses could be restored. That was the deeper concern, American production. By mid-1942, U.S. shipyards were accelerating output at an unprecedented rate. Liberty ships were being constructed in weeks. New Essex-class carriers were already under construction. German intelligence had underestimated how quickly the United States could convert industrial potential into military hardware. Midway suggested that even after suffering Pearl Harbor, America had absorbed the blow and responded with deadly precision. Within the German High Command, reactions varied. Some dismissed the battle as a temporary setback for Japan. Others saw something more fundamental, a demonstration that the United States could not be strategically surprised twice. The element of shock that had defined Pearl Harbor was gone. In its place stood coordinated intelligence, rapid repair efforts, and calculated counterattack. Hitler's own response was complex. He had never been a naval strategist in the traditional sense. His worldview was continental, focused on land campaigns and decisive offensives. Yet he understood symbolism. Pearl Harbor symbolized American vulnerability. Midway symbolized American resilience. Reports from Tokyo indicated that Japan was downplaying the loss publicly. Official statements described limited damage and emphasized future victories. But Berlin's analysts read between the lines. The absence of detailed triumphal communiques was itself revealing. More troubling still was what Midway implied for global coordination. The Axis alliance was bound more by shared enemies than by unified command. Germany and Japan operated in separate theaters with minimal strategic synchronization. There was no integrated planning comparable to what the Allies would later achieve. Germany could not directly reinforce Japan in the Pacific, nor could Japan meaningfully assist Germany on the Eastern Front. The alliance depended on momentum, on each partner maintaining pressure in its own sphere. Midway disrupted that momentum. If Japan was forced onto the defensive, American resources might gradually shift toward Europe. Hitler had long believed that the United States, divided by two oceans, would struggle to project overwhelming force simultaneously in both theaters. That belief now appeared less certain. Inside the Wolf's Lair, maps of the Pacific were studied with new seriousness. The vast distances that once seemed to protect Japan now highlighted its vulnerability. Supply lines stretched thin, island garrisons isolated. Without carrier dominance, those outposts could become liabilities rather than assets. For the first time, some German officers began to articulate a quiet but unsettling thought. Perhaps the war's timeline had changed. Perhaps the decisive window for Axis victory was closing. Midway did not produce immediate panic in Berlin. There were no dramatic speeches acknowledging defeat. The Wehrmacht still advanced toward the Volga. U-boats still prowled the Atlantic. On the surface, nothing had collapsed. But confidence is not only measured in territory, it is measured in expectation. Before Midway, many within the Axis leadership believed the United States could be strategically contained, delayed, and exhausted. After Midway, that assumption weakened. The battle demonstrated that American intelligence could penetrate enemy plans. It showed that American commanders could coordinate under pressure, and it proved that the U.S. Navy, even when outnumbered, could strike decisively. In war, perception shapes strategy as much as firepower. The destruction of 4 carriers was not merely a tactical loss for Japan. It was a signal, one read carefully in Berlin, that the industrial giant across the Atlantic was adapting faster than anticipated. The Wolf's Lair remained outwardly composed, orders continued, campaigns advanced, But beneath the routine of staff meetings and situation briefings, an uncomfortable realization had begun to form. The war was no longer unfolding according to Axis expectations. And if Midway marked the moment Japan lost the initiative in the Pacific, it also marked the moment some of Hitler's generals began to wonder whether time, once thought to favor the Axis, was beginning to favor the United States instead.
By late 1942, the true meaning of Midway was no longer measured in burning wreckage drifting in the Pacific. It was measured in shipyard output, steel tonnage, and production schedules. What had happened in a few hours above the waters near a tiny atoll was now colliding with something far larger, the industrial machinery of the United States. Before the war, many Axis planners viewed American power through the lens of World War I, slow to mobilize, politically divided, reluctant to engage fully overseas. They saw a wealthy nation, yes, but one unprepared for sustained global conflict. Even after Pearl Harbor, there was an assumption in Berlin and Tokyo that American industry would take years to convert into decisive military strength. That assumption began to collapse in 1942. American shipyards were operating around the clock. Massive industrial complexes in places like Newport News, Norfolk, and the West Coast were expanding at unprecedented speed. The United States had already begun laying down a new generation of fleet carriers, the Essex class, months before Midway. These ships were larger, more capable, and designed specifically for sustained carrier warfare. Even as Japan mourned the loss of 4 irreplaceable carriers, the United States was building replacements in numbers that dwarfed pre-war expectations. The difference was not merely technological, it was structural. Japan had entered the war with highly trained, elite naval aviators who had honed their skills over years of combat in China. Their training pipeline was selective and lengthy. Replacement pilots required time and fuel to achieve similar proficiency. After Midway, many of Japan's most experienced air crews were gone. Replacing ships was difficult. Replacing veteran pilots was even harder. The United States approached the problem differently. American planners recognized that modern war would be industrial and mathematical. They expanded pilot training programs dramatically, standardizing instruction and accelerating throughput. Thousands of new aviators entered the pipeline. Training bases multiplied across the country. Mistakes were studied, procedures refined, production scaled. For German observers, this shift was deeply unsettling. German intelligence had begun compiling estimates of American output. Reports indicated staggering numbers, hundreds of thousands of trucks, tens of thousands of aircraft, fleets of cargo vessels. Liberty ships, simple, standardized cargo carriers, were being launched in weeks. What mattered was not elegance, but quantity and speed. The Kriegsmarine understood this better than most. German U-boats had initially achieved devastating success against Allied shipping in the Atlantic. Early 1942 was even called the Second Happy Time by submarine crews as American coastal defenses struggled to adapt. But that advantage was already eroding. Improved convoy systems, radar, sonar, and air patrols were tightening the Atlantic lifeline. Now, with Midway demonstrating American offensive capability in the Pacific, the strategic picture grew darker. Grand Admiral Raeder and his staff recognized a harsh reality. Germany lacked the industrial depth to match prolonged American output. The Reich was fighting on multiple fronts: the vast Eastern Front against the Soviet Union, the Mediterranean, the Atlantic. Resources were finite, oil was scarce, raw materials were constrained by blockade and bombing. In contrast, the United States possessed immense reserves of steel, oil, coal, and manufacturing capacity, largely untouched by enemy attack. Its mainland was beyond the reach of German bombers. Its factories were not being overrun by advancing armies. Its workforce was expanding, including millions of women entering industrial production.
Midway had exposed something psychological. Industrial mobilization exposed something mathematical. If the war became a contest of attrition, ships for ships, planes for planes, the Axis faced a widening imbalance. Japanese carrier losses at Midway were not immediately replaced, but American carriers were already on the way. By 1943 and 1944, the U.S. Navy would deploy carrier task forces at a scale unimaginable in early 1942. Inside Berlin, some officers began comparing production curves. They studied tonnage figures, aircraft deliveries, tank output. The numbers did not favor Germany. The early lightning campaigns, Poland, France, the Balkans, had created a culture of decisive operations. Blitzkrieg relied on speed, shock, and rapid collapse of enemy resistance. But against industrial superpowers, speed alone was insufficient. Midway signaled that the United States could absorb losses and respond not with retreat, but with escalation. The destruction of Yorktown had not paralyzed American naval power. Instead, new carriers entered service, new pilots graduated, new task forces formed. For Hitler, who often prioritized bold offensives over long-term sustainability, the implications were uncomfortable. His strategic focus remained on defeating the Soviet Union. He believed that destroying the Red Army would force Britain into isolation and weaken American resolve. Yet Midway suggested that time itself might be an enemy. Every month that passed meant more ships, more aircraft, more trained crews. Meanwhile, Germany faced increasing strain. The Eastern Front consumed men and materiel at staggering rates. Fuel shortages intensified. Allied bombing campaigns were beginning to target industrial centers. The hope that Japan would permanently tie down the bulk of American naval power was fading. Industrial war is rarely dramatic. It does not produce the immediate spectacle of a burning carrier deck. Instead, it advances quietly, in blueprints, assembly lines, logistics chains. But its consequences are relentless. By late 1942, the broader pattern was emerging. The United States was outproducing the Axis powers combined in key categories. And unlike Japan, whose strategic perimeter required defending thousands of miles of ocean, America could choose where and when to concentrate force. Midway was not decisive because it destroyed 4 carriers alone. It was decisive because it occurred at the precise moment when American production was accelerating. The battle froze Japan's offensive momentum just as the United States shifted into full industrial stride. From Berlin's perspective, this convergence was ominous. If America could replace losses faster than Japan and eventually faster than Germany could inflict them, then the war's trajectory would bend steadily against the Axis. Victory would require not merely tactical brilliance, but structural parity, and that parity no longer existed. The illusion that boldness and early victories could permanently offset industrial disparity was fading. What Midway revealed in flames, American factories confirmed in steel. And for the first time, the war began to look less like a series of campaigns and more like a contest of endurance that Germany was not built to win.
By the end of 1942, the war no longer felt like a sequence of unstoppable Axis advances. The rhythm had changed. What had once seemed like coordinated momentum now looked fragmented, strained, uncertain. And although the Battle of Midway had taken place thousands of miles from Europe, its psychological impact reached far beyond the Pacific. For years, Axis strategy had relied on shock. Poland collapsed in weeks, France fell in 40 days, the Balkans were subdued with stunning speed. Even the early stages of Operation Barbarossa had pushed deep into Soviet territory with breathtaking force. Japan's opening campaigns mirrored that pattern. Pearl Harbor, Singapore, the Philippines, rapid strikes that shattered Allied prestige. But Midway was different.
It was not a slow, grinding defeat. It was sudden, concentrated, and irreversible. 4 fleet carriers, the very core of Japan's offensive power, were destroyed in a single battle. And unlike earlier Allied losses, this time it was the Axis that could not quickly replace what had been lost. Inside German military circles, comparisons began to surface quietly, not publicly, not in speeches, but in private discussions among officers who studied the broader strategic picture. Midway raised a troubling possibility. What if the era of decisive Axis victories had already peaked? The timing was critical. Even as Japan reeled from its carrier losses, Germany was driving towards Stalingrad and the Caucasus oil fields. Hitler believed that seizing Soviet oil reserves would secure Germany's long-term position and cripple the Red Army. Yet the campaign was stretching supply lines dangerously thin. The Eastern Front was consuming divisions at a relentless pace. Midway did not directly alter the fighting in Russia, but it altered expectations. Before June 1942, there was still an assumption within parts of the German high command that the United States could be contained strategically, delayed long enough for Germany to consolidate its gains in Europe. If Britain remained isolated and the Soviet Union collapsed, American intervention might become politically unsustainable. After Midway, that calculation seemed less certain. The United States had demonstrated that it could anticipate enemy moves, absorb initial shocks, and strike decisively. It had shown that intelligence coordination and operational discipline could offset numerical disadvantage. Most importantly, it had signaled that American engagement would not be tentative or symbolic, it would be sustained. For Japan, Midway marked the transition from expansion to defense. For Germany, it marked something subtler but equally significant, the beginning of doubt about long-term victory. Doubt in wartime is rarely dramatic. It does not announce itself openly. It seeps in gradually through production reports, casualty lists, intercepted communications. It appears in the cautious tone of staff briefings, in the recalculations of supply officers, in the private reflections of commanders who begin to measure not only territory gained, but time lost. By late 1942 and early 1943, the strategic map reinforced these concerns. In North Africa, Allied forces were regaining ground. In the Atlantic, U-boat losses were increasing as Allied anti-submarine tactics improved. And at Stalingrad, the German Sixth Army was encircled, a catastrophe that would soon rival Midway in symbolic weight. The pattern was emerging. The Axis could win battles, but it was losing strategic balance. Midway's deeper significance lay in its exposure of limits. It revealed that even the most experienced and confident Axis forces were vulnerable to intelligence, coordination, and industrial depth. It shattered the aura of inevitability that had surrounded Japanese naval power, and in doing so, it forced German planners to reconsider the durability of their own assumptions. Could Germany still win after June 1942? The answer depended on more than a single battle. It depended on whether swift, concentrated offensives could compensate for growing material disparity. It depended on whether the Soviet Union would collapse before American power reached full strength. It depended on whether the Axis alliance, loosely coordinated and geographically divided, could maintain simultaneous pressure across continents. Increasingly, those conditions seemed unlikely. The United States was not shrinking from the war, it was expanding into it. Shipyards multiplied, air fleets grew, troops trained for operations that would one day land in North Africa, Italy, and eventually France. The global balance was shifting, not in a dramatic instant, but in steady increments. Midway became, in retrospect, a psychological inflection point. Not because it ended the war in the Pacific, it did not. Not because it immediately doomed Germany, it did not. But because it marked the moment when Axis confidence began to crack under the weight of reality. The belief in unstoppable momentum was essential to Axis strategy.
Once that belief faltered, every setback carried greater weight. Every loss hinted at a larger pattern. The destruction of 4 carriers in the Pacific became more than a naval disaster. It became a symbol of vulnerability. By the time Germany faced catastrophe at Stalingrad in early 1943, the sense of irreversible shift was undeniable. Midway came first, a warning that industrial power, intelligence coordination, and strategic patience could overturn even the boldest offensives. In the Wolf's Lair, maps would continue to be redrawn, orders would continue to be issued, campaigns would continue to unfold, but beneath the surface, something fundamental had changed. The war was no longer about how far the Axis could advance. It was about how long it could endure. And in that quiet transition from expansion to survival, the true legacy of Midway was sealed.